Black sand trickled through his fingers as Alex cautiously touched the ruins rising before him. A massive pyramid, unmarked in any history book, loomed in the desert like a silent sentinel of a lost era. "So, this is it," he said, staring into the dark opening leading inside. "It's eerie," Judith whispered, wrapping her scarf tighter around herself. "It's just your imagination playing tricks on you," Stefan muttered, checking the lantern. Carl, holding the camera, was already filming. "Expedition into the unknown pyramid," he proclaimed solemnly. "4 fearless explorers embark on a journey from which perhaps not all will return." "Very funny," Judith murmured. Alex stepped forward and, gripping the lantern, entered the pyramid. The darkness inside was almost tangible, as if it had weight of its own. The air was stale, filled with dust and something else. Something disturbingly foreign. "It's just ancient smells," Stefan said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Carl pointed the camera ahead, then suddenly froze. "Damn, did you hear that?" From deep within the corridor, swallowed by darkness, came a sound, faint, like a breath. Judith stiffened. Was that the wind? Alex shone the lantern into the darkness, but there was nothing there. "Let's keep moving," he said. They stepped forward, unaware that they had just taken their first step into a true nightmare. Their footsteps echoed loudly through the narrow corridor. The lanterns cast trembling beams, tearing through the darkness, yet the shadow always remained ahead, elusive and eternal. Carl held the camera close to his face, his finger trembling nervously over the record button. "This place is oppressive," he whispered, trying to keep a cheerful tone, but his voice betrayed him. "It's just your imagination," Alex cut in, though he himself felt the same invisible pressure, as if the pyramid didn't want them there. Stefan stopped before a wall, studying the ancient hieroglyphs under the dim light. "These aren't ordinary inscriptions." He touched the stone. "They're a warning." "What does it say?" Judith asked, unconsciously moving closer. Stefan squinted, slowly deciphering the ancient symbols. "Do not enter, do not disturb. Those who sleep can hear." His voice broke off as the air around them vibrated with an inaudible sound. A whisper. Soft, barely perceptible, it swept through the corridor as if unseen lips had murmured it right into their ears. Judith gasped sharply, recoiling. "Did you hear that?" Carl stood frozen, staring into the darkness, the camera in his hands trembling. "That wasn't the wind," he choked out. Alex scanned the corridor, searching for the source of the sound. Nothing, only stone and darkness. "We've barely been here, and we're already jumping at shadows," he said firmly, masking his unease with confidence. "Let's keep moving." He took a few steps forward when something clicked beneath his foot. A second of silence. Then the corridor trembled. The walls shuddered, sand spilling from between the stones. And suddenly, from the darkness ahead, a deep sound echoed, like something massive had awakened. "Run!" Stefan shouted. The ground beneath them began to sink. Carl lunged backward, Judith clutched Alex's sleeve, and Stefan darted to the side. Behind them in the blackness, something stirred, something large, ancient, and it had already noticed them. The corridor trembled, sand poured from the ceiling, and it felt as if the pyramid itself was trying to bury them alive. Alex gasped for air, pulling Judith along. Carl, panting heavily, ran beside him, clutching the camera as if it were his only hope of survival. Stefan lagged slightly behind, his face pale, his eyes filled with panic. And then they heard it, a sound from the darkness behind them. At first, it was like the rustling of sand, but then it spoke. A whisper, thick, almost sticky. It filled the air from all directions, seeping into their ears, soaking into their thoughts. "You have disturbed the silence." The voice had no source. It seemed to come from the very walls. "What is that?" Judith screamed, her voice shattering against the stone walls. "Don't stop!" Alex shouted. But as they reached a vast stone chamber, they were met with a black abyss, a massive circular hole in the floor, like the gaping maw of some ancient beast, waited for anyone foolish enough to take a step too far. "Oh, God!" Carl skidded to a stop at the edge. Stefan glanced back. "We are not alone." Their lanterns illuminated something in the corridor's darkness. Eyes, dozens, maybe hundreds, glowing dimly like smouldering embers. They didn't glisten, they didn't blink, they only stared. Judith froze. This can't be real." Stefan grabbed her arm. "We have to move." "Where?" Carl gestured at the bottomless pit. "Are you suggesting we jump?" Alex turned. The eyes in the darkness were getting closer. The whisper was rising. "No choice," he whispered, and before anyone could protest, he leapt into the abyss. A second of silence. Then his voice echoed from below. "It's safe. There's a way down." Judith cast one last glance at the creatures behind them, clenched her teeth, and stepped over the edge. Carl and Stefan exchanged a look, then, in perfect unison, vanished into the darkness. A moment later, the whisper ceased. The eyes in the dark slowly melted into the pyramid walls, as if they had never been there. The fall was short, yet it felt like an eternity. Alex crashed onto something hard and cold. His lantern tumbled to the ground, casting weak beams of light around him. One by one, the others landed. Carl was gasping for air, gripping the camera, his hands trembling. Judith nearly fell, but Alex caught her. Stefan pushed himself to his feet and looked around. "Where are we?" They found themselves in a massive hall. The walls were covered in ancient symbols that seemed alive. It was as if they shifted and changed right before their eyes. "This can't be," Stefan whispered, running his hand along one of the walls. "These are older than any known inscriptions. They don't belong to this era." Judith slowly raised her lantern. The ceiling was covered in strange paintings, dark figures with elongated faces staring down at them. "I don't like this," Carl muttered, pointing his camera at the images. Suddenly his screen flickered. The image distorted, glitched. Then, for a split second, a face appeared. A dead face, shriveled, hollow, its wide-open eyes staring straight at him. "Oh, hell no!" Carl recoiled, nearly dropping the camera. "What? What did you see?" Alex demanded. Carl shivered. "There was something looking at me." Judith clenched her fists. "We need to find a way out." She took a few steps forward. Then something changed again. The air grew heavier, thicker, and from the darkness of the hall a sound emerged, not a whisper. This time it was a raspy, drawn-out breath, then footsteps, slow, steady, approaching from the shadowy corridor ahead. "Oh my God," Judith whispered, gripping Alex's sleeve. Their lanterns couldn't pierce the blackness. But something was there, and it was coming for them. The footsteps grew closer, heavy, resonating through the vast chamber. Alex swallowed dry air, gripping the lantern tightly. Carl, barely breathing, aimed the camera into the darkness, but the screen flickered again, showing only static and distorted silhouettes. "This "This can't be real," he whispered. Stefan, his fingers trembling, pulled a small fragment of limestone from his pocket, the one he had picked up in the corridor. "This place is ancient. We shouldn't have come here." "Quiet," Judith hissed, clutching Alex's arm. The darkness shifted. From the depths of the corridor leading further into the pyramid, something emerged, tall, gaunt. Its skin stretched tight over its bones as if dried out centuries ago. Eyes. No, not eyes. Just empty sockets, oozing thick black liquid. It stopped, and then it spoke. "You should not be here." The voice was rotten, as if it had clawed its way up from a grave. Carl choked on his breath. "Is that a mummy?" Alex stepped back, holding the lantern in front of him like a useless shield. "Who are you?" The figure tilted its head. "I am cursed, and now so are you." Then it moved, a sudden lunge, too fast to follow. Judith screamed. Alex yanked her aside. Carl stumbled, crashing onto the stone floor, but scrambled back up, grabbing his camera. Stefan stood frozen, staring at the creature, his lips moving soundlessly. This is impossible." The entity stopped before him, slowly lowering its head. "You can see me." And then Stefan screamed, his body convulsed, as if something unseen had seized him. His arms twisted at unnatural angles. Then he began to wither. His eyes sank into his skull. His skin tightened over bone. His mouth hung open in a silent, eternal scream. Within seconds, Stefan was no longer alive. He was a mummy, collapsing lifelessly onto the stone floor. Carl stood paralyzed, staring at what remained of their friend. "Oh, fuck! Oh, fuck!" Judith sobbed, pressing herself against the wall. Alex clenched his teeth. "We have to run!" He grabbed Judith's hand and bolted toward the dark passage ahead. Carl, still shaking, followed. Behind them, in the darkness, something laughed. Alex, Judith, and Carl ran through the darkness, their footsteps echoing dully against the ancient stone. The air had grown heavier, thick, with the putrid stench of decay. Carl was gasping for breath, but he refused to let go of the camera. He just dried up. Was that some kind of magic? "Stay together," Alex shouted, barely managing to keep hold of Judith's hand. They burst into another chamber, a massive hall with a towering ceiling covered in ancient carvings, figures of people, or not people. They were elongated, hollow-eyed, and in the center of the room stood an enormous set of gates, adorned with hieroglyphs and eerie symbols. Judith turned in circles, trying to make sense of the markings. This is the curse of the Guardians." "What?" Carl panted. Stefan was right. Her voice trembled. "This pyramid isn't a tomb. It's a prison." Alex raised his lantern. "A prison for what?" Judith looked at the gates. "For them." Carl turned, and at that exact moment his camera screen flickered. Distorted faces flashed across the display. They were not human. Stretched, with gaping mouths oozing thick black liquid. They stood behind them. Carl's grip on the camera tightened, his hands shaking. "They're here!" The darkness behind them shifted, eyes, dozens of them, emerging from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. And then they spoke. "You have opened the door. You are ours now," Carl screamed. Something unseen seized him, yanking him into the void. His scream tore through the air. Then silence. Alex and Judith stood frozen, staring at the empty space where Carl had been just moments ago. "Alex! Judith's voice trembled. He grabbed her by the shoulders. "We need to find a way out." Judith's eyes locked onto the gates. "There's something here." Alex stepped toward them, sweeping his lantern across the hieroglyphs. Then he saw it, a symbol unlike any of the others, a key carved directly at the center of the doors. "This is it," he whispered. Judith, her fingers trembling, reached out and touched the symbol. The ground shuddered, and then something growled in the dark. The darkness thickened around them. The rumble from the walls grew stronger, as if the pyramid itself had come alive. Alex and Judith stood before the massive gates, their bodies trembling with fear. Behind them, in the abyss of the chamber, the eyes returned. Dozens, hundreds, flickering, watching, closing in. Alex gripped the lantern, but the light no longer mattered. "We have to open these doors," Judith cried, her voice cracking with panic. She turned to the hieroglyphs. The key symbol carved into the stone pulsed faintly with light. Alex reached out and touched it. The ground trembled beneath them, and the air filled with a piercing screech like nails raking against stone. The gates began to open. A blast of wind rushed from the other side, dry, scorching, rancid with decay, and then they saw it, the entity. It stood beyond the gates, massive, shadowed, a being made of tar and darkness. Its hollow sockets were blacker than any void, swallowing the light around them, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. "You have awakened me." A chilling touch crept along Alex's skin. Judith gripped his hand. "This isn't an exit, it's a trap." The entity stepped forward. The entire pyramid shuddered. Behind them, the creatures lurking in the dark began to retreat. They were afraid of what had just awakened. "Alex, we have to." She never finished. The entity lunged, its blackened fingers wrapped around Judith's throat. She screamed. Alex rushed forward, trying to tear her from its grasp, but it was too late. Her eyes turned black, cracks split across her skin. She exhaled her last breath, and then her body crumbled into dust. Alex froze, his chest tightening in terror. He was the last, the only one left alive. The entity leaned in, its mouth twisting into a sickening smile. "You have been chosen." The gates began to close, and Alex understood this was never an escape. It was a choice. The pyramid had claimed all the others, and it had left him alone. Cursed, Alex stood in the darkness, his heart pounding, his throat tight with fear. He was alone. Behind him, the gates had sealed shut. Ahead, only the breathing void. The entity faded into the shadows, leaving behind nothing but a deep, satisfied laughter. "You are one of us now." The voice came from everywhere, seeping into his bones, into his mind. Alex turned. Judith, Carl, Stefan gone. The dust that remained of them was already mixing with the sand covering the floor of the pyramid. He tried to breathe, but the air had thickened. The pyramid was alive. Its walls quivered, oozing black slime. The symbols vanished, as if they had never existed, and then he heard it. Footsteps, slow, measured. Something was approaching from the depths of the dark. Alex stepped back, gripping his flickering lantern, and then he saw them. Stefan, Carl, Judith. But they were no longer themselves. Their bodies were withered, their eyes blackened, their lips stretched into unnatural grins. They walked toward him. "Alex," Judith whispered, her voice hollow, lifeless. "Join us," Alex gasped. "No, we've been waiting." They were almost upon him, but then a creak somewhere above. Alex looked up and saw it. A beam of light piercing through a crack in the ceiling. An exit. He lunged forward, not thinking, not stopping. They reached for him, their fingers clawing at his skin. "Don't go. You are one of us." But he broke free. With every ounce of strength, he climbed one stone, then another. Higher, higher. His fingers latched onto the ledge. The light burned into his eyes, but he didn't stop. Behind him, growling, hissing, the scrape of nails against stone. But he never looked back. And then, a cold breath of wind, a blinding flash of sunlight, and he fell into the desert. When Alex opened his eyes, he lay in the sand. The night was clear, stars shimmering above him, and the cold wind swept over his exhausted body. He survived. He escaped. But as he slowly rose to his feet, his chest tightened with fear. Behind him, in the darkness of the desert, stood the pyramid, and its gates were open. A whisper drifted through the wind. He had never escaped. He was part of this place now. Alex took a step forward, and then he saw it, his footprint in the sand, but it wasn't his. The shadows around him shifted. He hadn't survived. He had become one of them.